Hey guys, before we start, Logitech just wrapped up Logitech G Play 2025 where they announced a whole bunch of new products like the Astro A20Xs, they got a new super light mouse and a ton of other stuff. You can go to logi.gg/Datto to check it all out and use code Datto10 at checkout to save yourself a little bit of money. Threadlings and the hatchling perk have needed some help recently, and thankfully, both of those things have gotten some healthy buffs. Threadlings do 20% more damage to combatants, enhanced hatchling can make 2 threadlings instead of 1, and Weaver's Call got some good changes too, like threadling damage giving you rift energy. As someone who hasn't played around with threadlings in a very long time, because they just haven't really been good, I wanted to dive back in and see if they're, 1, any fun, and 2, any good. We're going to start with a Strand-focused setup before we talk about Prismatic. I decided to start simple and just throw on Swarmers to get a baseline feeling of where we're at with Threadlings. Destroying a Tangle spawns Threadlings, and they will unravel targets that they hit. Very simple. With Strand, I do think you have a fair amount of options pretty much everywhere in the subclass, but I went with Weaver's Call and the Wanderer. Weave Walk did get some buffs recently as well, and it does generate Threadlings, but I just liked some of the extra utility of the Wanderer a bit more, considering how easy it is to make Tangles, especially this season. That being said, we do have the Artifact perk, where spawning a Tangle gives that AoE suspend effect, so if you feel like you get enough value from that already, maybe you're in an activity where enemies are very tightly clustered, you can switch to something else. I am also choosing to use Empowering Rift over Healing Rift. It is a personal preference, obviously if you really like the healing, go for it, but Empowering Rift also got a rather significant buff, juicing your ability energy even more for standing in said rift. Fragments. Thread of Evolution is a lock, there's no flexing that one out, makes the most amount of sense here. Thread of Rebirth could feel like overkill if you're using a hatchling weapon, but it is there and it's more free threadlings. Generation is never a terrible decision, but it feels more like a placeholder fragment than anything, so if you wanted to flex this for something of your own choosing, absolutely go for it. And I went with Thread of Mind. Killing suspended targets gives class energy because we're using the Wanderer. We have no actual suspend triggers in our kit otherwise, but with the Artifact perk and with the Wanderer, suspends should be somewhat plentiful. If you're not on Wanderer, then this can also be flexed out. If you do a lot of finishers, maybe you're in some endgame content where they're a lot more valuable, you might want to look at Finality, Warding if you're making a lot of orbs, or maybe Isolation to provide easy sever on bigger targets. That one also goes a very long way in endgame content. From the Artifact, what are we grabbing? Well, basically anything with the word Strand in it. 2 new perks have shown up at the bottom of the Artifact, Threadling Proliferation and Pack Tactics. Those are staples, combined with any other Strand perks or elemental pickup perks that spawn a Tangle. Stats-wise, I think you do want to spec into some form of grenade, class, and weapon stat. Our grenade stat doesn't affect Threadlings other than the ones generated from our grenade itself, and unfortunately, no, Threadlings are not considered a buddy that will start to benefit from grenade stats, like Hellion and Arc Soul and all that kind of stuff. But it's still a good supply of Threadlings, and I don't really want to throw those stats into like health or melee or anything like that. If you do go with Weave Walk, then you might want to spec into like 100 melee or something like that for the regeneration, although you'll probably want something else to help restore those melee charges, like a Monte Carlo. Your class stats should be as close to 100 for the regen rates as possible, but I'd also understand if you wanted to spec really hard into class for the overshield if you're not running with Healing Rift. However, the Prismatic variant gives a lot of class ability energy innately in the kit, so if you find yourself with too much class energy, you can dial this back. For what it's worth, I sat in between 75 and 95 for this video across all the different setups that I tried, and I really didn't feel like I needed to dial back my class energy. Weapon stat isn't a terrible focus either, and the same goes for super. There will absolutely be some amount of shooting in this experience. It's not like you're just only using Threadlings, so having a little extra ammo gen and weapon power is never a bad thing. Your super also does generate Threadlings, but it's really just like the icing on the cake more than it is the cake itself. Mod-wise, I'm not really doing anything insane. Dynamo for the super energy, grenade font for a little more damage on thrown Threadlings, although I don't think this is needed at all if you want to go with some other sort of ability regen stuff here, or even reload speed. You got resistances in the chest, surges in the boots if you can make it work, and then some class ability stuff in the class item. This is a very, very typical setup. I'm not doing anything crazy here. Before we go to gameplay, though, I do want to talk about the Prismatic variant, since both setups do play somewhat similar. Prismatic does have Weaver's Call and Threadling Grenade, so we're going to grab both of those here. Your second aspect depends on the exotic that you go for. I have an exotic class item with Filaments and either Starfire, Verity, or Swarm. And like hell, even Harmony is not a terrible choice. Filaments is the big thing, though. Filaments gets us Devour from Empowering Rift and even more class ability energy, which means we could go for Hellion instead, which will get grenade stat benefits in an upcoming patch. If you choose to go for a different class item, or maybe an exotic that doesn't get you Devour, then Feed the Void is just too good to pass up. Like, Devour is still that good. Fragment-wise, Hope is going to be a staple. You will have some sort of elemental buff all of the time, but otherwise, there isn't any Threadling-based stuff in your fragments. I would just say then, as a result, to spec for being well-rounded. So, Dawn for some on-demand Radiant and Anti-Barrier, although your melee regeneration is probably going to be terrible. Purpose, if you like Woven Mail. Protection, just because it's really solid. And Solitude, because Sever is really good. If you want to spec for more Transcendence energy, I think that's totally fine too, since being Transcendent in this build isn't really punishing like it is with that Hunter build that we talked about a little while ago. You could grab Balance for some more grenade energy, but you should already have a good amount from Devour that I think you could probably use something else. So in trading Strand for Prismatic, you do lose the Wanderer and a bigger focus on Threadlings themselves and their damage and potency for a lot of other neutral benefits like Devour and Hellion and Transcendence. Is there that big of a difference between these two setups? Actually, yeah. So let's talk about gameplay. I think the Strand version of the build is definitely more of a pub stomper build when it comes to solo play. When you're in that like -10, -20, maybe -30 range where things are just kind of chill, it's super easy to keep the engine rolling for a really long time. You're never really at risk of death, so it's okay to go a little bit riskier with the lack of healing that this build has, or if you really want to switch to Healing Rift, you totally can. Normally, I like to run with Buried Bloodline to have Devour, although the rate at which I can actually proc and maintain Devour is not as high as I want in something like group play. But when you start to enter the -30, -40 level ranges, when you're solo, that's when things get a bit iffy. In this -40-ish gameplay here, you can see that while I do have some moments here and there, I am basically running for my life half the time, trying to stay alive. This is partly due to champions. I need to tailor my loadout to be able to deal with them, and this build does have a somewhat stricter loadout requirement in my opinion. Being able to use Strand weapons really helps make the build feel complete, especially with the hatchling buffs. I also wasn't using any boons in this activity, but it goes without saying that you should try to include as many boons as possible, specifically Grenadier if it's available. In group play, where the pressure isn't entirely on you and you can actually move around and not be under constant threat in some of these higher level ranges, I think it's a really fun time. It's awesome having so many Threadlings roaming around in an area. The uptime and the activity levels on the build are pretty high for those of you who want a higher APM experience. The extra utility from the Wanderer is great too for all the bonus suspends, which is just a very good effect. Is it the strongest build I've ever played? Not really, but is it at least an option to play with that can actually now contribute to the team? Totally. The Prismatic variant, on the other hand, is night and day difference when it comes to the solo potential of the build and your survivability. I'm using the Filament Swarm class item in this footage. Prismatic is just so highly powered, especially on Warlock, with everything that it can get. Devour is permanently up with very little investment, and I don't care how boring Hellion is, it's incredibly good. Devour is feeding you grenade energy to deploy more Threadlings, and it's giving you that healing, which is one of the greatest weaknesses of the build in the pure Strand version if you're not running Healing Rift. Plus, you have Transcendence, and it too can have really high uptime. This is also around 40 levels under with no buffs, and I'm able to just tank almost anything that I want. It would not surprise me if your Threadling uptime was higher on this setup solely because of Facet of Hope and Devour. I will say that with the setup that I ran in this clip, my light Transcendence energy was maxed out so much faster than my dark because of my weapon and because of Hellion, so be sure to balance your weapon elements to compensate for that, or even your fragments. A weapon to consider, if you happen to have it, is Euphony. It's from Salvation's Edge, it's the raid exotic, so don't worry too much if you don't have it, but it does also provide a good amount of Threadlings, and your damage scales with Threadling damage. However, you need to make sure that you're fighting against targets that will actually live long enough for you to spawn Threadlings and also maybe stack the bonus damage as well. It's a weapon that I would use probably for medium to high difficulty content as a result, although there's nothing wrong with using it in easier stuff if you really want. I imagine Mint Retrograde will be stapled to quite a lot of people because it gets anti-barrier this season, it can roll with Hatchling and a damage perk, it gets a boost in the artifact from the energy acceleration perk, and generally speaking, it is one of the best new weapons available. But I wouldn't be surprised if you wanted to run with a Strand primary instead for some higher uptime with Strand weapons in case you chose to have anything involving your Strand weapons in the kit. Even Slice is something to consider on the Prismatic version of this build, since you should be dropping so many class abilities that your uptime with it will be incredibly high. Although if you really want that much Sever, you should probably just take Facet of Solitude. When it comes to class items, I think a little more testing needs to be done, which was outside the scope of this video, but Filaments is doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. It is the mandatory perk. Swarm gets you Threadlings on Tangles, which you should have a good amount of. Starfire gets you more grenade energy from empowered weapon damage, which you should be doing a lot of. Verity gets more grenade regen and damage, but you need to be using Strand weapons, which you really should be. And Harmony is more super energy from weapon kills matching your super, and Needlestorm is, not that bad at all. As long as you have Filaments, any one of these options should be just fine. Just make sure you're playing into it. Personally, I plan on running the Strand version of this build when I'm in a group, and the Prismatic when I'm not, or if the stakes in the group content are a lot higher or the difficulty is a lot higher. I think the Strand version is a lot more fun because there's a little more going on than the Prismatic version, and your Threadlings hit harder, and the APM's higher, but I can't deny the power of the Prismatic version, man, which is, it's kind of disappointing to me, because I feel like the Strand version should be a more tantalizing option for, like, the Threadling build on Warlock, which is kind of their thing. But when so much of your neutral game on Prismatic is just like, I don't die and I get a billion Threadling grenades and class abilities, then it's like you just have the freedom to do whatever you want, and the power is just so high. Let me know if you've been playing around with Threadlings since the patch, or if you're trying out a particular class item, or maybe if you're even messing around with Weave Walk, which wasn't my thing personally. That's why I didn't really talk about it in this video. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time.